If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this. People, what is the scariest, spookiest paranormal being you have ever encountered? A friend of mine lives out in the country, in a super backwoods area. One night, 3 of us, 2 of my friends and I, were all at his house swimming in his above-ground pool. So before I go any further, I have to discuss Willow. Willow is the nickname we gave to his fictional deformed brother that lived on his property. It was kind of a running joke in his family that they had one son who was deformed and he lived on their land. Weird, I know. So we were all in the pool just hanging out and talking when, from the corner of my eye, I saw a black silhouette. It was on the other side of the fence, and it looked very large. It had the appearance of a wolf standing on its hind legs. My friends didn't see it at first until I told them. Everyone in this situation would freak out a little, but my friend who actually lived there went insane. He jumped out of the pool and ran into his house at full speed, leaving my other friend and me in the pool, freaking out. We sat around just looking at this figure that appeared as though it was staring right at us. We shortly thereafter ran to our cars, which were parked close by, and called our friend. Eventually, we all met up again on his porch and talked about it. We were still sacred, but the kid who lived there still seemed really messed up. He was shaking and barely wanted to talk. I'll never know exactly what I saw that night, but there is still one question I can't shake. Did my friend know something that we didn't? Was his family's joke about his deformed brother more than just a joke? I always got that feeling that maybe, just maybe, there was something he wasn't telling us. I hike a lot in remote areas. I was hiking in Pennsylvania, miles from anything. I was not even on a trail, just bushwhacking through the woods, when I came up on this guy about 200 feet away, sitting on this log. He was just sitting there in jeans and a hoodie over his head, staring at me. I wave. He doesn't wave back. I start walking over, wave again, and yell something like, "Wow, I wasn't expecting to see anyone else out here." No response. I was getting a little nervous, but I had already committed, so keep approaching. Then I started noticing rock piles in circles and things, like scraps of clothing, hanging in the trees. I get about 10 feet from him, and this freaking pheasant takes off, scaring the crap out of me. That's when I noticed it was a mannequin. Sitting there, dressed up, surrounded by strange rock piles and things hanging in the trees, miles from anything. I hightailed it out of there, thinking maybe I'd come upon something drug-related. I have no idea. I used to take our dog for a walk every lunchtime during a summer holiday back in 2006. I was about 16, I guess? My parents' house is on the outskirts of town and is surrounded by fields and greenbelt on 3 sides, and I used to take him out into the more wooded areas. When winter rolled by, my dad noticed a large police presence in the woods and asked one of the officers what was going on. Apparently, a dog walker had seen the body of a suicide victim hanging in one of the trees. Turns out, I'd been walking directly under his body for 4 months straight. It was only when the leaves fell that he was discovered. I was on a cross-country drive solo heading out west, and because I was solo, I didn't want to waste money and time on a motel when I could just grab some sleep in my car. At around 11 or 12 at night, I arrive at a rest stop in the middle of nowhere, I would assume Louisiana or something. The nearest exits were about 20 miles apart from each other and were like towns with 300 people max. I don't know what caused me to wake up, but I opened my eyes and saw some guy in front of the driver's window staring into my car. I assume he was a bum by how he was dressed. There were no other cars around except for one big rig. I don't know what he was doing there at 3 a.m., but it freaked me out because it was literally just the highway and nothing else nearby. Nothing. The dude tried to open the door, and I just sat there. He left without seeing that I was awake, but as he was leaving, I just turned on my car and kept driving. Crazy thinking about how things would have gone if I forgot to lock my door. Back when I was a teenager, me and my friends would drive to this little dead-end town in the mountains. There was this abandoned, and condemned, bed and breakfast there that had been shut down for years. Apparently, the upstairs floor has started to collapse. I mean, this place was built in the 1800s. Anyway, we used to go there to scare ourselves, as it was rumored this place was haunted. One night when we went out there, we were all shining flashlights in the upper windows. I kid you not, one of the curtains on the farthest right upper floor window slowly opened, stayed open for about 10 to 15 seconds as if someone was looking at us, then slowly closed. There is very little possibility someone would have been in a condemned B&B at midnight, let alone on the top floor that was collapsing. It was very creepy, and still years later, we used to go and break in and drink in there and whatnot, and we have heard and seen some more creepy shit, but this one instance stands out. My dad told me the story of when he and his brother lived in this small, two-story slum with narrow stairs. There were not enough rooms, so my dad slept on the couch some nights while his brother slept upstairs. He woke up one night sweating and freaking out because he couldn't move in his sleep and claimed a smoky figure was floating above him watching him sleep. Now I have sleep paralysis. It's hereditary, so when he told me this story, I thought sleep paralysis was a likely explanation. He told me he thought the same thing, and then my uncle told me his half of the story. My uncle woke up in the middle of that same night with a bad feeling and went to check on his brother, my dad. He notices some kind of fog rolling in from the first floor, so he quietly investigates it. Halfway down the stairs, he freezes in place and sees a dark, shadowy figure hanging right over my dad as he sleeps. First Filipino instinct, turn on the light and pray as loud as the bullet vendor. Dad wakes up, of course, in a cold sweat, and they compare stories. I visited that house once, walked in, saw the exact same setup as they described, then walked out. Never visiting again, ha. Bob and Rusty love camping and generally dicking around in the woods. Living in West Virginia, we've got a shitload of places to camp. The first story is about when they went down along a local river for a few miles and found a good place to set up camp on the side of a hill. They're sleeping in hammocks that are hung from trees. Bob was farther down the slope, by the river, and Rusty was a little higher up, so they were only about 15 feet apart. Bob has trouble sleeping and lies there for a while. Rusty goes to sleep immediately. After an hour or two, when it's pitch black out, Bob starts hearing a weird, really hushed noise coming from Rusty's hammock. He assumes it's just Rusty being an asshole. The noises go from soft grunting to humming. When the noises stop, Bob goes back to sleep. The next morning, Rusty asks why Bob was humming in the middle of the night. Bob tells Rusty that he thought he was the one humming. They figured it had to be some weirdo that came up in between the hammocks and was ducking with them in the middle of the night. The next story is at the crack of dawn, when Bob and Rusty are out driving around the mountains. They get to the top of the mountain, where there's an ancient gravel lot. They wait there a while as a bank of fog washes over the peak. Rusty decides he needs to relieve himself and wanders off into the fog to find a tree or shrub. Bob stays by the car. A couple minutes go by, and Bob feels like a cigarette, but Rusty has the only pack, so he wanders in the direction he headed in. Suddenly, Rusty looms out of the fog and brushes past Bob, heading back to the car. Bob turns around and follows him. But when he gets back to the car, Rusty is nowhere to be seen. Bob yells at Rusty, and Rusty grunts back from just out of sight. Bob sits down in the car and waits for Rusty to come back. 5 minutes later, Rusty comes out of the fog and asks why Bob was yelling at him. It turns out there was just a random third guy wandering around in the fog. When the fog cleared out, there wasn't anyone else around, and they didn't see any cars coming in or out. When I was in college, I would visit my parents often. I lived about 45 miles away. It was an easy commute, I got to eat home-cooked meals, and I had my own room. Suffice to say, I went home every other weekend. It became such a regular thing that when I couldn't go home, I would call my parents to tell them I wasn't going. So one weekend, when I couldn't make it home, I called my mom to tell her. During this call, my mom tells me this story. She was taking a midday nap when a noise woke her. The noise was the sound of a woman hysterically crying. She described it as a sad, breathy wailing. Her first thought was that it was me, so she jumped up and raced towards my room. As she reaches my door, she calls my name, and the crying suddenly stops. She peeks into my room and finds nothing. That's when she remembers that I'm not at home. My mother heard this crying one more time, about 4 months later. At the time, I was just like, sure, Mom, I don't believe her. I told her it was probably the wind. Fast forward about 1.5 years, and I'm now living back at home. So one day I'm sitting in my room on my computer, and my mom is in the family room right outside my door watching Dr. Phil. I'm passively listening to the show as well. When suddenly, out of nowhere, I hear a woman crying or wailing. It's this sad, breathy cry, just outside my door. Just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. It lasted about 5 to 7 seconds. While my mind tries to rationalize what I just heard, my mom asks from the other room, "Did you hear that?" I tell her yes. She says that's the exact same sound she heard the previous times. To this day, I can't explain what I heard. It was so clear and unmistakable. It was a woman crying. So the summer going into my freshman year of high school, we went on vacation to a rural area of Pennsylvania to visit some family. Well, being from the city, I thought it was so cool at first to get to see the mountains and rolling plains, followed by forests that seemed to go on forever. But anyway, one thing I didn't realize is that when it gets dark, It gets very dark, so one night when we were there, my brother and I were walking in the woods, and it started to get dark. We didn't realize the urgency of getting the duck out of there, so we took our time finding our way out, but that's when it happened. At first, we thought we heard a wolf howling, which is scary enough because wolves will kill you before you even realize what hit you. But then the sound got a lot closer in what seemed like a matter of seconds, like it was flying above us. But it didn't sound like a howl anymore, it sounded like a woman screaming. It was ear-piercing, and honestly, I get nervous just thinking about it. As we were running, it seemed to follow us, screaming and whatnot. It was very dark, so I didn't get a good look as we were running, but what I did see looked like it had small or medium-sized wings and a horse-like head. But like I said, I only got a good look twice before we made it out of the woods, and the screaming stopped a little bit after we broke the tree line and were greeted by my uncle holding his rifle because he had heard us or something else screaming. After that, I didn't go out at dusk anymore, and when I got home, I did some research, and I found out that there is something called the Jersey Devil that has been seen in Pennsylvania. To this day, I swear I saw what I now know was most likely the Jersey Devil. I got out of the military in 1988. I was 22. I met a girl at one of my first jobs, and we started hanging out. After a while, the inevitable meeting of the parents occurred. I noticed while walking through their tiny apartment that her mother had the eyes of a crazy person. Also, I caught a glimpse of this weird shrine-looking thing over the entire dresser of her mother's bedroom. The old man slept on the couch. The girl was punk. Think American hardcore from the 1980s, 1990s, with a touch of nerd. I don't remember how the conversation started, but she was terrified of the supernatural. I was probably teasing her about something along those lines because, a month into our relationship, it was late October. She told me their last house was exorcised. It was a long process, starting with verification from a team of demonologists, approved by the church, and taking almost 2 years to get okayed from the Vatican. There were 2 priests in the country allowed to perform the ritual, one on the East Coast and one on the West Coast. The East Coast dude lived in Connecticut. He did it, and things calmed down afterwards but never stopped until they left the house. Then she pulled out some paperwork and trash magazine clippings, like old articles from their story in the National Enquirer and others. She said the 2-year wait let it get out of control, but it was subtle at first. Her parents were always fighting, and afterward there would be bad smells or cold spots in the old stone farmhouse. Then it sounds like banging or knocking, at night and during the day. Their animals, 2 cats and a dog, were stressed at odd times unrelated to the screaming matches. Dead, then mutilated, animals started to appear in the yard, on the porch, and eventually in odd patterns like displays in the yard. After random SHTs started flying around the house like cups, spoons, and falling pictures, larger things began manifesting. Towards the end, there were beast-like entities toppling dressers and demon dogs rushing out of the woods at night, leaving hoof prints. She was dead serious and done talking about it. Okay, whatever. About a week after she told me this story, we were hanging out watching TV when I noticed binoculars by the window. I asked if her mom was bird watching, which was odd in a congested apartment complex in the suburb. She said no, that her mother was keeping an eye on the witch across the street. I jumped up, and before she could get out the word stewed, WTF, I grabbed the binoculars and pulled the drapes about just enough to peek through. Directly, and I mean directly, across the dark street was one dimly lit window. There was a naked woman in it with black symbols painted on her torso. I could only see her from chin to crotch, but she was performing these hectic ritualistic movements, and it wasn't funny, sexy, or anything I wanted any part of. I stopped teasing her. 2 summers ago, I went cruising on the family sailboat with my dad, and one of our first stops was a little park island up in BC waters, Jedediah Island. It used to be a homestead farm belonging to a family, and when the last farmer had died, he'd willed the property to the province to be a park. The ruins of the family's homes are still there, and the island is filled with feral sheep and goats from their abandoned herds. We wanted some solitude, so we anchored in a tiny bay at the north end of the island, and when I rowed ashore, I was totally alone. I got onto the trail, walked a few yards into the woods, and almost walked straight into the remains of a sheep that someone had hung from a dead tree. I looked around, and there were 4 to 5 sheep skeletons in various stages of falling apart hanging around and a lot of bones. No hunting was allowed, so either someone was poaching and leaving the corpses or just hanging up whatever they found creepy. My buddies and I always go camping each summer in the forest and always have strange experiences up there, but this one was by far the creepiest. We needed wood for the fire, so a friend and I volunteered to get some. We will call her Sarah for the sake of the story. We decided to go for a brief walk through the forest and found this large fallen tree in an open clearing of trees, Deforestation is very bad where I am from. We decided to climb onto this tree to have a chat. I climbed onto it and leaned down to pull Sarah up. With my back to the forest. Just as she peers over my shoulder, she just freezes up. The next few words she said to me just instantly sent a cold shiver down my spine. I don't in any way want to scare you, but I can see a girl in a dress behind you, 20 feet away from me across the tree-line entrance to the forest. She described the figure as a girl wearing a white gown with no face. And long black hair. I don't know how, but I kept my cool, calmed her down, and walked her back to camp. But it gets worse. We were around the fire, and she turned to me in silence and explained that the girl was now on a small ledge just a few feet away from the tents. So I suggest we both go into the tent and try listening to music to distract her. But first she needed to pee. I walk with her to look after her, and this is the last experience she has. As we walk back to camp, she now sees the figure standing beside the tents. We climb into one of my friend's tents across the other side and try to forget everything she has just seen. So a couple years ago, on a Friday night, I was driving around a dark, wooded area. My girlfriend was in the passenger seat, and my friend was in the back. We didn't really have anywhere to go, so we were just looking for a spot to park and chill. So I turn onto this dark, empty street that leads to a secluded park in the woods. As I'm making the turn, I spot something in the corner of my eye, right on the edge of the light from my headlights. The hair on my back stood up because something was not right about whatever I saw. It's hard to describe, but I'll try. It looked like a Doberman walking on its hind legs with short, skinny arms. It was about 3 or 4 feet tall. I figured it was probably some animal, like a raccoon or something, and I was just bugging. But then here's where it got weird. About 10 seconds after we passed this thing, my friend in the back seat says, "Yo, this is going to sound like a stupid question, but did you just see some weird dog head thing walk by back there?" Before I could say anything, my girlfriend chimed in, "Holy shit." I wasn't going to say anything, but seriously, what the duck was that? So I stop on the side of the road, and we all talk about what we saw, and it turns out we all saw this bizarre bipedal Doberman creature. My friend says we should turn around and see if we can find it. Like I said before, I don't really believe in the supernatural or whatever, so I was down. My girlfriend was very reluctant, but she agreed because she's a good sport. So as I'm putting the car in drive to do a U-turn, we all hear this scream coming from behind us. It sounded like young girls screeching or something. My girlfriend starts crying, and my friend just starts slapping me on the back, shouting, "Go! Go! Go! Get the duck out of here!" I peel out and drive until we are back in a residential neighborhood with streetlights, never looking back. To this day, none of us can figure out what the duck we saw. We'll bring it up and joke about it, but it still kind of freaks me out. Anyway, that was probably the creepiest thing to happen to me. This was in the early 1980s, before I was born. My sister had come down from Toronto to visit family and friends. Our parents live, and still do, in a rural area that at the time was all forest and farm country, and still is, but not as it used to be. She left around 9, but on the way home, her car broke down. Luckily, it was in front of a house. So she walked up to the house and asked to use their phone, and she called my dad, who came down, and the family was kind enough to let her park her car in the driveway because they couldn't get it going. While on the way home, now around 10:30, near 11, they were driving through a heavily wooded section of the area, the radio was up, and they were just talking when suddenly they heard this incredibly ducking loud and human scream. Dad slams on the brakes, and both of them are freaking out like, "What the duck was that? Did you hear that?" etc. Then, out of nowhere, this 6-7 foot tall coyote with a black/white striped tail walks across the ducking road in front of the car on its hind legs. When it finally passed, they heard the scream again, only it was 10 times louder than before. Dad slammed on the accelerator and got the duck out of there. He never saw it again. A few years ago, my friend was in the Navy, and when he had some time off, he would spend weekends and holidays with me and my family since they were across the country. We lived just outside San Diego in the mountains on a large, isolated ranch. During one of his visits, my family went out of town to visit a sick family member, and he and I stayed to care for the animals. He would normally call his girlfriend and talk to her outside the house, just to be alone. When he did it that night, I decided to scare him because I'm an ass like that. It was spring, and the frogs in a creek near my house were crazy loud, so I knew he wouldn't hear me sneak up. I did, and when he said goodnight to his girlfriend, I scared him, and he screamed, and we laughed. So we were walking towards the house, and I nonchalantly said, "What if all those frogs and bugs just went silent at once?" He laughed and said that it'd be freaky, So he grabbed a rock and threw it at them in the dark and got like a tiny section to go. Quite for a second we laughed a bit more, then kept walking. As we got to the porch, I noticed an odd feeling that just felt heavy. The closest thing I could describe it as would be a warm breeze pushing on my back. Except it wasn't comforting at all. I looked at him and could tell he felt it too. We looked back into the pitch black and couldn't see anything, and that's when I noticed the silence. Just completely silent, no frogs, crickets, or anything, just my racing heartbeat. We stared into the dark, not sure of what we expected to see. Honestly, I think we were too afraid to move. Then we heard a single sound, a loud snap of a stick being snapped as if stepped on. That sound both terrified us and was the catalyst to break the paralysis that held us in place, so we noped right into the house, locked all the doors, bolted the windows and blinds, and watched action movies on the TV in the laundry room until we passed out in the early morning. We had dragged the set into it as it was the only room centrally located and had no windows. Last summer I was driving home from a family party. The party ended pretty late, so I was driving back at around 1 or 2 a.m., and to get back down to my place from the house I was at, I had to drive down this pretty windy little mountain road. There are a few homes on this road, but for some reason there are only 2 street lights on the entire road. Anyway, I was driving down this road, and after I had passed the street lights, I saw this figure in the distance just standing in the middle of the road. Mind you, this was in the part of the road with no homes to either side, just a cliff to one side and a rocky wall on the other. At first I thought it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but I had not had any alcohol that night because I knew I would be driving, so I slowed down and turned on my lights to see what it actually was. The figure turned to me, and it was the most horrifying looking old woman I had ever seen in my life. She started to laugh for some reason and began running, and I mean a full-blown ducking sprint, towards me, so instincts just kicked in and I managed to maneuver around her as fast as I could and speed home. After passing her, I checked my rearview mirror, and she was just standing there in the middle of the road. To this day, I have no idea what she was doing up there. I've driven down that same road late at night but never seen her or anyone else wandering the road any time after sunset. Needless to say, I couldn't sleep that night. I grew up in southern New Jersey. When I was a younger man, my friends and I would spend at least one night a week looking up and testing Weird NJ stories. For those who don't know, Weird NJ is a publication that prints ghost stories and such from around the Garden State. I have a few good stories from this part of my life, but I've decided to settle on the one time I legitimately felt like I could probably have been murdered. We were investigating the mysteries of Clinton Road, apparently a hotspot for paranormal activity due to cult activity, KKK lynchings, and all kinds of other bad things that make you question whether or not society as a whole was really a good investment of mankind's time and energy. I should also likely mention that Clinton Road is technically 2 lanes but is only wide enough for 1 car to traverse. Furthermore, there are no streetlights, so you can see every star in the sky, which is actually quite nice, if catastrophically dark, when passing under the thick canopy of foliage that encapsulates parts of the roadway. Now, Clinton Road has more than one haunted attraction along its 4 or so mile length. First on our agenda was the bridge. The story goes that a little kid dropped his ball over the lip of this little, tiny bridge and fell over the railing trying to get it back. Under the bridge is a shallow bed of cedar water and gravel, so the little boy snapped his neck and died. The story in Weird New Jersey stated that if you throw a coin into the water, the helpful spirit of the child will throw it back up to you. So, myself and 2 friends parked the car a few hundred feet from the bridge and walked over. Along the way, all 3 of us heard what sounded like metal scraping along the pavement directly behind us. We whipped around and saw the faintest hint of a spark fading away, its incandescence grossly intensified by the crushing darkness of this backwoods road. Slightly rattled, we continued onward. We sat on the guard railing and tossed a coin into the water. Sploosh. Followed by nothing. We waited and tossed another coin. Sploosh. And nothing once more. As we were preparing to call it a day and move on to the next location, we heard a soft splash. Followed by another. Then another. I turned on my flashlight and scanned the water below. Some soft rippling, but nothing alarming. I searched the banks at the water's edge and found nothing. The noise had stopped, so I cut the flashlight, thinking it was some fluke of nature. As soon as the light went off, the splashing resumed and intensified. Louder and faster. Coming from below, in the water, and towards my friends and me. I turn the light on, and again the noise immediately quiets, though this time the water is rippling much more noticeably. Concerned but not scared, we cut the flashlight one more time. This time, it sounds as though a rather large man is barreling towards us from the water below. My friends and I look at each other and silently agree to run away. Discretion is the better part of valor, after all. We pile into the car, and my friend fires up the engine and peels the duck away from whatever perceived demon was chasing us. We cross over the bridge and around the dead man's curve that immediately follows it when he slams the brakes. A massive herd of deer is crossing the road slowly. Honestly, more deer than I've ever seen at one time, easily 100 or more. We patiently wait, and as the deer exodus comes to a close, the car inches forward. At this point, a fawn confidently strode into the road, slowly turned its head into the headlights of my friend's SUV, and screamed. Its scream sounded like that of a small child, the panicked, painful scream of a little girl, wordlessly begging for her life and pleading for help. It was an otherworldly, mournful sound that makes the hairs on my neck stand up whenever I think of it, some 10 years later. My creepiest story would have to be the one when I was about 3.5 or 4 years old. Not too sure what age. My parents bought an old house that they ended up renovating and remodeling. From an old, unfinished thing to a fairly decent 3-story home. Before buying the house, the caretaker did mention that a little girl hung herself in one of the rooms. She never said why. Also, this place used to be where the Japanese buried the dead when they invaded the country during World War II. So yeah, creepy ass place already. My parents bought the house anyway. So one night, my uncle said I was left playing in our playroom/guest room when he came in to find me huddled under a table staring at the bed, where he saw 2 ghostly kids with bright red eyes fighting over one of my toys. Although he wanted to get the hell out of there, he couldn't leave poor little me, so he silently called for me in hopes that he wouldn't get their attention. He said I was able to crawl to him, and he just bolted us both the hell out of there. To this day, I have no vivid memory of those kids except that whenever I do think of this story, I see the same scene as though it were a distant memory somewhere in the back of my head. And that's my creepy story. My grandmother's childhood home. Going back almost a century, my grandmother was born and raised on a farm in Yugoslavia. When she was about 18, the Second World War broke out. They weren't Jewish, so she and her family, of 7, left the country. Years later, they returned to their home to find 3 dead soldiers there. My grandma, who was the youngest in her family, inherited the house after her family had passed away. When I was in my 20s, 2004, I believe, my grandparents and my mother were going to see family in what used to be my grandmother's hometown. I asked to tag along, and they agreed so long as I found my own way there. They had already bought their tickets, so I bought a ticket, and a few days later I flew out, a few hours after they did. We spent a lot of time admiring the scenery. I only speak English and a bit of French, so I couldn't really communicate with the locals, so most of my time was spent wandering around sightseeing, and on the day before we left, my grandmother asked if we wanted to see her old house. Of course, we all agreed. When we arrived at the house, it seemed far more decrepit than I had expected, almost like something from a film, but inside things were different, dusty, but in amazing condition. My grandmother went off to explore as she hadn't seen the house in decades, and my mother and grandfather followed, but I decided to explore on my own. The way the house looked made things feel almost magical when you were alone. After looking around a bit, I found a closed door. I tried to open it, but it was stuck. I forced it open and found it led to the basement. The basement was dark, dirtier, and less furnished than the rest of the house. I used a light on my keychain to see around the room. I had only been looking around for a few minutes when I felt a hand on my shoulder and someone said something to me in what I presumed to be German. It startled me, so I turned around and found that no one was there. Naturally, I got out of there quickly. This was my last nightmare. I was floating on a little wooden raft, handcrafted by a few of my friends and me. It was really dark and gray out, overcast shadowed the lake that we were on. I could see a little decaying cabin out in the distance with a half-destroyed dock. Everyone was just sitting on the raft, enjoying the day. Then we heard a tapping coming from the bottom of the raft. Click click. It was eerie because we were in pretty deep water, there weren't any trees or debris under us. Click click. The tapping continued rhythmically. Click click. It sounded like someone was knocking on one of the pieces of wood. Click click. Nobody wanted to check it out. I decided I would be the one to check it out. I poked my head over the side of the raft to try to see underneath. Click click. I saw just the form of a hand tapping on the boat. It receded back into the water and came back up. Click click. I had to see who or what was doing this. I got into the water. Click click. I waded closer to the bottom of the boat. Click click. I squinted really close. There was a body under the water. She stared at me in the eyes. I was paralyzed. Her dark black hair streamed across her face. She had streaks of mascara running down her face. I heard a soft voice saying, "You shouldn't have come into the water." The form rushed at me. I jumped out of bed, scared to SHT and in a cold sweat. True story. I grew up in a small farm town with a population of 2,000. I was in high school at the time and dating a pretty young lady from the next town over. On a warm and sunny Sunday afternoon, we decided to hike down the road from my house onto a trail that cut through a long forgotten and overgrown cornfield across from an abandoned dairy farm. About a mile and a half into the field, we decided to take a left and chase each other down a couple rows of dried up corn stalks. I was trailing my girl, both of us giggling, when she suddenly stopped dead in her tracks. When I caught up to her, I too swallowed my laughter. At the end of the row was a small clearing lit by the sun. Slightly off center was a man, standing perfectly still and facing us. He looked clean. His hair was jet black and slicked back, and he wore a perfectly white long-sleeved shirt and pants, with a large white scarf covering his neck. His skin was tan, and his only movement was a slight lean as a breeze made its way through the field. I could only manage to say, "What the duck?" when my girl turned around and started running back to the trail. I did the same, and we didn't stop or say a word to each other until we reached the road. There were no visible vehicles, although we didn't thoroughly investigate since we just wanted to be as far away from the strange, sunlit man as possible. Before I was born, my parents bought a rundown house for a really cheap price. 2-story house with 3 bedrooms, sufficient lighting, and is livable. Right behind the house, a river is located, and when rainy season comes, the house will be flooded and wild animals will enter the house. It's not a great location, though, and yet my parents were desperate to find somewhere to live after they got married. The last owner of the house was an old lady who was on her deathbed and wanted to leave some money for her daughters before she died. Well, 2 weeks after my parents signed the papers, she sadly passed away. My parents never knew anything about the history of the house. A colleague of my parents who lived in the same area introduced the owner to my parents. All I know is that the house was built in the 1920s and was one of the first to be built in the area. So time passed. My sister was born 4 years before Mr., and we grew up there till I was 7. We had a good memory of the house, yet there was an event that my family and I could never forget. When I was 6 years old, my parents' room and our room, my sisters and I, were right beside each other. I was a scaredy cat who always wanted to sleep beside my parents. Although, that one night that I didn't, something bizarre happened. Before my sister and I went to sleep, we brushed our teeth, and my sister accidentally spilled water on her pajamas. She changed into a new set of pajamas, leaving her wet set in the bathroom. We then shortly fell asleep. I woke up at 3 a.m., feeling extremely cold and confused. I lived in a country where it was always hot throughout the year. We didn't have an air conditioner at the time. So with limited ventilation, the room was usually extremely hot. Looking around, still feeling confused, I was able to hear my sister's deep breathing on top of the bunk bed. Her breathing was in rhythm, and I didn't bother to check on her. I remember walking towards the door to move to my parents' room. Right outside our room is where our living room is located. A big gray couch is located in the center of the room, and there was my sister, wearing wet pajamas, sitting on the floor in front of the couch. Her face was partly covered by her hair. Her hands were on her knees, where she was squatting while staring at me with a smile on her face. I vividly remember staring at her back and wondering, who's this girl? Is she my sister? I was extremely scared and dumbfounded, remembering that my sister was fast asleep in the room. Although it's hard to deny, she looked exactly like my sister. I remember that she was really pale and had the same haircut as her. But then, if she isn't my sister, then who is she? Who's the girl that's sleeping on top of my bunk bed? After a minute or two of staring, I remember running as quickly as possible to my parents, leaving the mysterious girl outside with a story to tell the next day. In college, I worked with a guy named Kyle who had a pretty distinctive look. He had half his head shaved and a biomechanical tattoo on his scalp. I got a call at work that my uncle had suddenly collapsed and probably wasn't going to live much longer. Kyle agreed to take my morning shift the next day so that I could go and say goodbye. I spent the next day at the hospital with my family. My uncle was taken for tests at one point, and we decided to go for lunch. We ended up across the street at Panera Bread. I walk in, and sitting there is Kyle. I panicked because if he didn't cover my shift, we were both going to get into trouble. The shift change hadn't been approved by a manager or anything. I come charging up to him, and he looks at me and blinks, confused. He greets me by name, but he's acting all drowsy, like he just woke up or is really high. I ask him why he isn't covering my shift, and he says I'm covering your shift. Figuring there was a miscommunication, I say the shift started 3 hours ago, it was the morning shift, and he repeats I'm covering your shift. He still sounds really out of it. My phone was in the car because we couldn't have it in the ICU, so I went over and asked my aunt if I could borrow hers to call work. While I do, I see Kyle just sort of wander out of the restaurant. I make the call, and to my surprise, Kyle is the one to answer the phone in his normal voice. He's been there the whole time. The second Kyle is now nowhere to be seen. Once I thought about it, it made no sense that Kyle would have been there anyway. It was an hour's drive from where he lived, and he isn't the type to eat at a Panera. The second Kyle didn't have food or anything, he was just sitting there. When I told Kyle about this, he told me a few other stories of people seeing him in places he wasn't or couldn't be. Some of them really creeped me out. I still can't explain it. In the middle of winter, about 4 a.m., at least 30 inches of snow cover the ground, not the road. I was driving back from a casino towards Virginia, Minnesota, just north of Cloquet, Minnesota. My friend and I were about 4 car lengths behind a pickup truck and gaining, so I went to switch lanes. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed movement and looked just in time to see some sort of bipedal running full speed across the road, in front of the truck, into the right-of-way, and off into a forest. The truck slammed on its brakes, as did I. My friend and I looked at each other slack-jawed as we crept past the truck in complete shock, too scared to stay stopped because we both knew we saw something extraordinary. The truck driver looked like he had seen a ghost and appeared in shock as well. We noped it out of there as fast as we could, trying to process what just happened. We got a few miles down the road and simply asked each other if we just saw what we thought we just saw. Without a doubt, we both witnessed something less than 4 feet tall and impossibly sprinting on 2 legs through damn close to 3 feet of snow. We went back to her place outside of Virginia and locked the doors and windows. It didn't matter, as neither of us could sleep a wink that night. To this day, I wish I would have stopped and spoken with that truck driver to see if he got a better glimpse, as he was a yard away from smoking the goddamn thing. Nope, nope, nope. I know I saw a Bigfoot. My stepmother used to own property in a small lake town that was primarily used for summer homes. Some friends and I went camping there about 10 years ago. One day we decided to walk the local trails, and we came upon an unmarked cemetery. Some of us were already into paranormal stuff, so we went and checked it out. Then we left and continued up the trail. A very short way up was a gravel clearing, gated off. In the center of that clearing was a triangle-shaped structure about 8 feet high, 5 feet wide, and 3 feet thick. Essentially, it looked like someone cut off the top of a church and tossed it in this circle. We thought it was weird and neat, so we snuck in. On the front of the structure was a small door with the thickest, most diesel padlock I've ever seen. It was about the size of a balled-up ball resting in the other palm. Being the most skeptical but also the most intrigued, I decided to go up to it, but as I got close to it, I simultaneously got a panic attack and fell ill. Dizziness, blurry vision, nausea, faintness, chills, and cold sweats. Essentially every symptom of the worst migraines I've ever had was on top of the panic attack. I almost fell over when one of my friends caught me, pulled me away from the thing, and got me back through the gated area. As soon as I was outside of that circle, every symptom stopped instantly. I didn't dare go back in there, nor did any of my friends. I'd been to several places checking out paranormal stuff over the course of 8 to 9 years at that point, including 4 years living in a house where weird, unexplained things happened fairly regularly, and this is the first time I'd seen anything like that. I tried searching for what that structure might be, but I never found any results. When I was young, maybe 9, we randomly moved to this small town in New Hampshire. My mom's boyfriend lived at the end of a mile-long dirt road and only had one neighbor just a ways up. He had a very large backyard and a big willow tree right in the middle. One night, before my mom and I went back to our apartment, the two of them got into a fight. We went to leave, and he decided to be a spiteful bag and turn off all the yard lights so we couldn't see our way back to the car. Cell phones didn't exist yet, and we didn't have a flashlight on hand, but we slowly made our way to the car. About halfway up, we heard a loud howl coming from the yard that almost sounded like it ended in a seemingly human laugh. It was followed by a couple more, overlapping each other, with the same eerie laugh sounds. My mom and I bolted to the car, and her boyfriend threw on the lights, which didn't quite reach all the way to the willow tree. We saw the light reflect off of several spots near the tree that looked like they could have been eyes, but as my mom turned on the headlights, the car was facing the yard, there was nothing there. If it were just me, I'd say maybe an overactive imagination, but my mom, her boyfriend, and his 2 kids also saw or heard it. I have no idea what that could have been either. Friends at school said that it almost sounded like it could be coy dogs, and perhaps it was, but they certainly disappeared as quickly as they showed up. My little sister used to sleepwalk. One night, I heard her leave her room and walk down the hallway. It was like 1 a.m., so I decided to follow her and make sure she was alright. Except when I went out to follow her, she was gone. I looked around upstairs for her, but she wasn't anywhere, so I went downstairs. I thought she'd be in front of our parents' door, but she wasn't there either, and all the lights were off. So I searched the basement for her and finally found her standing in the bathroom in the dark in front of the mirror. I said her name, and she calmly turned around, looked at me, and then started bawling. I took her back upstairs, calmed her down, and got her back to bed. Afterwards, I don't know why, but some inner big brother thing in me kicked in. This is really cheesy, but I got very protective for some reason. I turned, looked down the hallway, and very sternly said, "Stay away from my sister." I don't know why I said it or who I said it to. But I know that when I turned around to go back to my room, I felt a whisper, my skin crawled, and my hair stood straight up. I don't believe in anything. I'm an atheist and all that stuff, and I very much don't believe in the afterlife. But I have never been more scared than I was that night. Cat's name was Sarah Daisy, and after we got her, I was 17 at the time, she quickly became very attached to me, despite there being 2 brothers, 2 sisters, and my mom and dad living in the same house. It started with her following me everywhere. Then she started peeing on my pillow while I was sleeping, I assumed to mark territory. Anywho, I bought a lock for the door and locked her out of my room every night to prevent this from happening. Only it didn't, somehow my door would become unlocked or opened in the night, and she would have peed on my pillow again. I asked my family if anyone was messing with my door or unlocking it, and they all denied it. Anyhow, my younger brother was always mean to the animals when they slightly inconvenienced him, and one day when just him and me were home, I heard clear as day a little girl's voice that I didn't recognize. Anyhow, my sisters were at school, coming from the end of the hallway saying, "Mikey, help me, please. I'm in here, and I'm scared. Mikey, help." So I cautiously crept towards the end of the hall and heard the same little girl screaming for help coming from the bathroom. So I opened the door quickly and heard the shower was on. I opened it and found Sarah Daisy stuck inside. My brother had put her in there as punishment for something. I dried her off and went to find him and asked if he heard the cat yelling, talking, or screaming, and he just looked at me weird and basically told me to F off. A few months later, I'm sitting at the computer desk, which happened to be near the stairs leading to the basement, which my brother was using as his own room, and I hear again the same little girl's voice yelling, "Mikey, help. I'm in the basement. I can't get out. Help me." Followed by loud banging. My brother was running up the stairs as fast as he could, looking white as a ghost. I told him to go let her out, and he flat out said that there was no way he was going back down there with her there, so I went down and let her out of a tall empty refrigerator box he had tossed her in as punishment, or for fun, who knows. He now believed me about Sarah Daisy talking, and that night we told our parents, who of course didn't believe us. Unfortunately, this was pre-smartphone days, or else we would have recorded that for proof. When I was about 12 or 13, I had 2 friends stay the night. I can't remember the time, but it was very late. My brother and parents were both asleep in their rooms. My friends and I were in the living room. I'll spare everyone the details of explaining the layout of my house, but basically, if anyone were to get up, or mess with us or try and scare us, we would notice them immediately. Anyway, the 3 of us are goofing off, talking, and laughing. All of a sudden, we hear what sounds like a young girl humming, loud and clear as day, coming from my basement. All 3 of us instantly exchanged a wide-eyed, terrified look before bolting up the stairs to my room. I didn't bother bringing it up to my parents or brother, and I haven't heard it since. My basement always had a very creepy or dark feeling to it, and whenever I was down there, I was very uncomfortable and felt like something was watching me. This was the last house my parents lived in together before their divorce, and there was a lot of negative energy in that house. When my mom's friend was helping her move, he stated how something dark was definitely there and you could strongly feel it the moment you walked in. Growing up, I lived for a few years in the north of England before I moved back to Warwick again for my parents' jobs. We lived in a small town where a row of abandoned Victorian cottages backed onto the park across the street from my own. There were 4 of these things back to back, 3 standing and the 4th gutted from fire damage, separated from the edge of the park by a wire fence and the hedge that had grown around it. The rumor among the local kids and a few local adults was that one of them had been home to a family who'd lost the father in the First World War and the rest of whom had perished in the following flu around 1919. Locals would occasionally venture inside the said cottage, and it honestly did seem haunted, or what a haunted house would feel like, which I say as someone who's never believed in ghosts or anything really supernatural. The place always seemed chilly no matter the outside temperature. It had a heavy and unhappy atmosphere that was honestly noticeable when you passed through the door frame, and inside there were knocking and scratching noises that I always told myself were rats. Inside, it was full of dirt, graffiti, and rubbish, but also, and more worryingly, needles and some blood stains. There were also some weird books written in what must have been Greek or Cyrillic characters that someone had scribbled strange drawings in. I had 2 friends who swore blind that the aforementioned family had been buried under the floor of the back room, and several people claimed that you could hear knocking or scratching sounds coming from under bare concrete if you put your ear to it. About 15 years ago, some Navy buddies and I decided to go ghost hunting. We had heard of this place where some serious SHT would happen. It was a park near a beach and rail tracks in Pensacola, Florida. We went there and found that it was a trail through some woods that would go towards the railroad tracks, then come back to the main road about 1/4 mile away. We went in, and everything was dark but not too creepy. About a quarter through the trail, one of my buddies started freaking out about some dude following us. We looked and saw nothing. We kept going, and he was knocked to the ground. He started struggling to get up. His eyes were bulging, and he wasn't breathing. He was struggling and trying to get up, but couldn't. He was reaching for the wooden rails but still couldn't pull himself up. He even ripped 2 fingernails out of his fingers while trying. We tried to help him up, but we couldn't get him up. This was odd because he was the smallest one of us. It was like he was being held down. His lips were starting to turn blue, and he was frantic. Then, in the struggle, my other buddy's silver cross fell out of his shirt, and then everything stopped. We hightailed it out of there and never went there again. We actually never went ghost hunting again either. This happened to me, my brother-in-law, and my aunt in 3 different rooms of my house. I was sleeping in my room, and I woke up in the middle of the night to see a woman in a white dress and large black hair asking me, "Are you cold?" And I just said yes, thinking it was my mom or one of my sisters. Then she tucked me in, and I went back to sleep. The next day I went to ask everyone in the house if someone went to my room to tuck me in, but they said no one went there. I told my aunt, and she told me that the same thing happened to her, except that she noticed that she didn't know the woman, and she just covered her face. In that same house, my sister heard a man's voice right next to her ear when she was going to sleep. Every day, you could hear people running around the house, moving stuff, and the most scary thing that happened was that my sister was studying with a friend and my Bill, and the 3 of them saw a dwarf thingy running in the backyard of my house. Finally, my mom contacted a woman. She talked to my mom first. They didn't know each other and had no way of knowing anything about us, and the woman started asking her questions like, "What's your name? How old are you?" And then she asked my mom how many kids she has. My mom says 3, and the woman says, "No, you have 4 kids, the oldest one died when you had 3 months of pregnancy." My mom was shocked, and then the woman started to describe our house. She had never been there. Finally, she went to our house, told us that there were 3 different portals in my house, one of them in my room, which was always cold, BTW, and told us that there were 2 ghosts, a man and a woman, and that they came to my house because they saw that a kid, me, was playing alone, and they went there to play with me. She then started to kind of exorcise my house. After she was done, the running stopped, we never heard or saw anything again, and my room was never cold again. This story is from my brother-in-law. This took place in Mexico. My brother-in-law, Uriel, and his family had a house on the corner of the street. His parents always worked and never had time to do the house chores or look after Uriel, so they hired a housekeeper or nanny. The nanny was a teenage girl who was around 12 years old when she started working for them. Uriel said that in the beginning everything was great, and she did all her chores. The house was pretty big, so it was pretty impressive that, at her age, she was able to keep up with all the cleaning. They had a big staircase that led to a second story. Uriel said as soon as you got on the top step, there was a very big Victorian mirror, which was recently given to his parents by some acquaintances. The family started noticing that the girl would always glance at the mirror. The glances then escalated, and she began staring at the mirror. She would stare to the point where she would stop doing her chores and just stay there for hours at a time. She wouldn't speak to anyone and did nothing else but stare at the mirror. The family became very concerned and alerted her family. When her family came to pick her up, they couldn't separate the girl from the mirror. She was in a sort of hypnotic state. They took her to the local witch doctor, and the witch doctor said something in there had taken her and that it had just left her body behind. She was in a vegetative state. It would all come to an end when Uriel's family ordered that the mirror be stored in the basement. One of the movers accidentally stepped on the mirror, and it broke. Minutes later, the girl's family called Uriel's family, saying that the girl had begun convulsing and that she had passed. The story goes, park your car on a certain bridge in a certain swamp, turn off the motor, shut off the lights, turn off the radio, and shut the duck up. After sitting quietly for a while, you might be visited by a ghost. If the ghost is there, you'll hear it tap. I've visited this spot 7 or 8 times, and I've had the tapping interaction 3 or 4 times. I've been there in several different cars. I've been there with a host of different people. The tap sounds like someone's fingernail hitting the car. Sometimes it's a quiet noise. Sometimes it's so loud that it makes everyone in the car jump out of their skin. Loud or not, it always sounds like a fingernail. You'll hear the noise in different spots all over the car. One time it hit loud as duck right next to my face on the window glass. Everyone in the car is looking at me, I'm just sitting there with my hands up, like, I didn't do that shit. There were many instances like that. Okay, Joe, stop fooling. At one point, my buddy went, hey, watch this. He tapped twice on the window, and immediately there was a 2-tap response. Bud tapped 3 times, and it tapped 3 times. Proceed. To freak the duck out, we ended up asking it some questions. One time, it followed us home. Real freaky shit. I was driving in an unfamiliar area with my cousin. She knew the area, but she was tired and it was late, so I drove, and she was telling me how to get back to her house. She lives basically in the middle of nowhere, and we were in the woods. We went around a curve, and I slowed down because I was watching for deer, and she said, one time a woman in a blue nightgown jumped out of the trees around here at my car. I knew she was just trying to scare me, so I ignored what she said. The curve straightened out, so I sped back up, but then, I swear to God, a woman in a blue nightgown hopped out onto the road. I swerved to go around her because there wasn't time to stop, but just as fast as she appeared, she was gone. It was like she had never been there at all. It was insane.